12 men walked on the moon. 12 human beings stood on that powder gray surface, looked up at a black sky, and saw Earth hanging like a fragile marble in the void. They came back to ticker tape, presidential handshakes, and the eternal label of hero. They smiled for the cameras, shook the right hands, and told the world about the science, the rocks, the technical achievements. But there was something else they brought back, something heavier than lunar samples, something no spacecraft could carry and no engineer could measure. Charles Duke was the 10th man to set foot on that desolate world. He was 36 years old, a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and the voice from Houston that Neil Armstrong heard when Eagle touched down in 1969. By every official metric, his mission was perfect. But what the official reports never captured, what the mission transcripts never recorded, and what Duke himself hid for nearly a decade afterward, was that the moon broke him. It broke him in a way that no doctor could see, no camera could film, and no amount of national celebration could fix. And the truth he finally revealed decades later had nothing to do with alien structures or government cover-ups. It was far more unsettling than that. It was about what happens to a human soul when it touches the edge of infinity and realizes how small it truly is. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Charles Duke was before he left Earth. This was not a man prone to fantasy or philosophical wandering. He was a product of the Naval Academy, the Air Force Test Pilot School, and the Astronaut Office at the height of the space race. In 1969, while Michael Collins orbited alone above the lunar surface, it was Duke's voice that crackled through the static, calm and precise, guiding humanity's first steps on another world. He was 29 years old. He had already done what most men spend lifetimes dreaming of, and he had done it without breaking a sweat. That was the Duke that NASA loved: steady, rational, unflappable. The kind of man you strap to a rocket and trust not to panic when the engine's cut off, and the only thing between him and eternity is a thin wall of aluminum and titanium. 3 years later, in April 1972, Duke got his own ride. Apollo 16 launched toward the Descartes Highlands, a region of the moon that scientists believed might unlock secrets about the early solar system. Duke was the lunar module pilot. Commander John Young flew beside him. For 71 hours, they lived on the lunar surface, driving the rover across ancient plains, collecting rocks that had sat undisturbed for billions of years, planting the American flag in soil that had never known wind. By the numbers, it was flawless. Every objective met, every sample cataloged, every experiment completed. When they splashed down in the Pacific, the flight surgeons declared them physically healthy. The psychologists declared them mentally stable. The nation declared them heroes. But declarations are not the same as truth. What Duke experienced on the moon did not fit into any checklist. It did not register on any instrument. It happened in the quiet moments between official duties, in the seconds when he stood alone on the surface and realized that every human being he had ever known, every tree and river and cloud he had ever seen, every story and war and kiss in the history of his species, was contained in a single blue and white sphere hovering in the sky above him. And around him, stretching in every direction to a curved and airless horizon, was a desolation so complete that it made the Sahara Desert look like a garden. No color, no sound, no life, no movement except the slow creep of shadows as the sun burned overhead. The moon was not merely dead, it was aggressively, violently empty. A cemetery of rock and dust that had never known a whisper, a breath, or a prayer. Duke had trained for years to walk on that surface. He had studied the geology, memorized the procedures, practiced the maneuvers until they were muscle memory. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the spiritual weight of the place. He was a Christian by upbringing, though not a particularly devout one. Like many military men of his generation, he kept his faith in a box, brought out on Sundays and holidays, practical and unobtrusive. But standing on the moon, looking at Earth so distant and so alone, something cracked open inside him. Not a revelation of extraterrestrial intelligence, not a discovery of hidden structures, something far more personal and far more terrifying. He felt the overwhelming scale of creation, and in that scale he felt his own insignificance. Not the comfortable humility of a man who knows his place in the world, but the crushing vertigo of a man who realizes that the world itself is a speck, and he is a speck upon that speck. The official transcripts from Apollo 16 record Duke saying enthusiastic things about the rocks, the rover, the landscape. And he meant them. He was a professional, doing a job. But between those transmissions, in the gaps where the radio was silent and his heart rate monitor showed only the steady beat of a trained pilot. He was fighting a war inside his own mind. He described it years later as a feeling of abandonment. Not abandonment by NASA or by his crewmates, but a deeper, more primal sense that he had traveled farther from the source of life than any human being was meant to go. The moon was not hostile. Hostility would require intent. The moon was simply absent. Absent of God, absent of meaning, absent of everything that made existence feel like more than a chemical accident. And in that absence, Duke felt something he had never felt before. He felt despair. This is the part of the story that never made the evening news. The hero returned to Earth, rode in the parades, visited the White House, and smiled for the photographs. But inside, he was descending into a darkness that no one around him could see. He began to drink, not socially, not occasionally, but heavily and in secret. The man who had maintained perfect control at 200,000 miles from Earth could not maintain control in his own living room. His marriage, which had survived the pressures of the Astronaut program, began to fray. His wife Dottie watched the man she loved withdraw behind a wall of silence and bourbon. He could not explain what was wrong because he did not fully understand it himself. How do you tell your neighbors, your colleagues, your country, that walking on the moon was the loneliest experience of your life? How do you admit that the achievement of a generation felt, in your private heart, like a journey into spiritual exile? NASA had protocols for physical recovery. They had doctors, nutritionists, exercise regimens. They had debriefings that lasted for weeks, analyzing every switch flip and every fuel reading. But they had no protocol for existential crisis. They had no checklist for a man who had seen the edge of everything and come back unable to feel at home in his own skin. So Duke did what men of his generation were trained to do. He buried it. He performed the role of the astronaut hero, gave the speeches, shook the hands, and drank enough to sleep through the dreams. For 6 years, he carried the weight of the moon like a stone in his chest, visible to no one, slowly grinding him down. Then, in 1978, something happened that would have seemed impossible to the Charles Duke of 1972. He had what he would later describe as a genuine encounter with Jesus Christ. Not a philosophical realization, not a gradual awakening, a moment of spiritual clarity so powerful that it split his life into before and after. He was at a Bible study, invited by a friend, skeptical and defensive, when the words he was reading suddenly connected with the experience he had been trying to outrun for 6 years. The emptiness of the moon, the fragility of Earth, the overwhelming sense that human beings were small but somehow seen. It all snapped into focus. He had not been abandoned on the moon. He had been given a glimpse of creation so vast that only something infinite could have authored it. And the despair he felt was not the absence of God. It was the absence of his own willingness to see God in the emptiness. This was the secret Duke had been hiding. Not evidence of ancient lunar civilizations, not classified photographs of impossible structures. The secret was that the moon had destroyed his old understanding of the universe and replaced it with something that terrified him until he found the faith to accept it. He later founded a ministry. He began speaking openly about his struggles with alcohol, his marital crisis, and the spiritual earthquake that began not in a church, but in a pressure suit on the lunar surface. He told audiences that walking on the moon was the greatest physical achievement of his life, but that it was meaningless compared to the spiritual journey that followed. He said that standing on that dead world and seeing Earth as a gift had forced him to confront the question that every human being eventually faces. If we are that small, does anything matter? And his answer, forged in the years of pain that followed, was yes. Precisely because we are that small, every choice matters. Every soul matters. Every act of love is a rebellion against the void. Other moonwalkers understood this, even if they spoke of it differently. Edgar Mitchell returned from Apollo 14 and founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, dedicated to exploring consciousness and the nature of human experience. Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, descended into depression and alcoholism that took him years to overcome. James Irwin of Apollo 15 became an evangelical Christian who searched for Noah's Ark in the mountains of Turkey. The pattern is unmistakable. The moon did not give them aliens. It gave them perspective. And perspective, when it is sudden and absolute, can be as destructive as any physical trauma. These were men trained to suppress emotion, to prioritize data over feeling, to treat fear as a problem to be solved. But the moon does not care about training. The moon simply shows you where you are, and where you are is a tiny, temporary creature standing on a dead rock in an infinite vacuum, clinging to a world so beautiful and so fragile that it breaks your heart to look at it. Duke's testimony, when he finally gave it, was not what conspiracy theorists wanted to hear. There were no monoliths, no ancient ruins, no smoking gun of a government cover-up. There was only a man, broken and rebuilt, trying to explain that the most important discoveries of the Apollo program were not geological, they were spiritual. NASA had sent scientists to the moon and brought back poets, priests, and wounded healers. The rocks they collected told us about the history of the solar system. The experiences they brought back told us about the nature of the human soul when it is stripped of every distraction and forced to face the raw fact of existence. The cost of this knowledge was real. Duke's marriage nearly ended. His health suffered. He lost years to a darkness that began the moment he stepped off the ladder and felt lunar dust crunch beneath his boots. And he was not alone. The astronaut corps has a divorce rate, a depression rate, and an alcoholism rate that far exceed national averages. The public sees the launch and the landing, the flag and the footprints. They do not see the 3 a.m. awakenings, the marriages and counseling, the men who cannot explain why standing on the pinnacle of human achievement felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. NASA learned, slowly and painfully, that sending humans to the moon was not just an engineering problem. It was a psychological and spiritual problem of a magnitude no one had anticipated. When Duke speaks today, at 89 years old, he does not speak with the clipped precision of a Capcom. He speaks with the tremor of a man who has seen something so vast that language still fails him half a century later. He says that the moon taught him that Earth is not just a planet, it is a gift, that life is not just a biological process, it is a miracle, and that the emptiness of space is not a threat but a frame, a vast, dark canvas that makes the light of human consciousness shine brighter by contrast. He says that he walked on the moon as a technician and came back, eventually, as a believer. Not because he saw God in the lunar dust, but because he felt God's absence so acutely that the presence became undeniable once he returned to the world where presence is possible. So what is the real secret of Apollo 16? What is the truth that Charles Duke carried in silence for 40 years? It is not that the moon hides alien structures. It is that the moon hides nothing. It is naked, empty, and honest in a way that Earth is not. And that honesty is unbearable to a human soul that has spent a lifetime building walls of distraction, ambition, and noise. The moon strips all of that away. It leaves you alone with yourself, with the stars, with the silent judgment of a universe that does not know your name. And in that aloneness, you either break or you find something stronger than yourself to hold you together. Duke broke. And then he was rebuilt. That is his story. That is the story he could not tell in 1972 because he did not yet understand it himself. That is the story he hid from NASA because they did not have a box on their forms for spiritual collapse. That is the story he shares now, not for fame or controversy, but because he believes that the next generation of explorers needs to know what they are really getting into. Space is not just a frontier of physics and chemistry, it is a frontier of the human heart. And the heart is not always ready for what the frontier demands. The 12 men who walked on the moon were pioneers in the oldest and truest sense. They went to a place no human had been and brought back knowledge that changed us. But the most important knowledge was not about the composition of lunar basalt or the mechanics of low-gravity locomotion. It was about what happens to a human being when he stands at the farthest point of human reach and realizes that the journey inward is longer than the journey outward. Charles Duke traveled nearly 250,000 miles to the moon, but the real distance he covered was the space between his own despair and his own redemption. And that is a journey that no rocket can make for you. If the next era of space exploration teaches us anything, it should be this. We are sending human beings to Mars, to the asteroids, to worlds more distant and more desolate than the moon. We are preparing their bodies with exercise and radiation shielding and carefully calculated diets. But we have barely begun to prepare their souls. The moon broke Charles Duke because he was strong enough to survive the trip and honest enough to admit what it did to him. The question is not whether we can reach the next world. The question is whether we can come back whole. And the answer, if we are brave enough to listen to the men who have already been there, is that wholeness is not something you bring with you into space. It is something you either find there, in the silence and the emptiness, or you spend the rest of your life searching for it back on Earth. Charles Duke walked on the moon in April 1972. He left his footprints in the dust, and in some sense, he left part of his soul there too. But he brought something back that was more valuable than any rock. He brought back the truth. Not the truth about alien civilizations or hidden NASA secrets, the truth about what it costs a human being to touch the edge of infinity and return to tell the tale. It costs everything you thought you knew about yourself. And if you are lucky, if you are honest, if you do not drown the truth in whiskey and silence, it gives you something better in return. It gives you a reason to keep living that has nothing to do with gravity, atmosphere, or the pull of Earth. It gives you faith. Not faith in rockets or flags or nations, faith in the one thing the moon could not show him, but could not hide either. That in all that emptiness, across all that distance, he was still seen, still known, still loved. And that is the only discovery from Apollo 16 that truly matters.